The rising storm. The sound in the hall was not loud, but it was not silent either. It was the kind of noise that came from hundreds of people breathing together, thinking together, waiting together. A low hum, like wind pressing against a window, before a storm. The large lights above the stage flickered once, then held steady. Journalists clutched their cameras. Tech leaders sat with their hands folded tightly in their laps. Students and young engineers leaned forward in their seats, full of hope. But behind their eyes was a growing question, one they dared not speak out loud. Where was Sundar Pichai? The clock was already ticking past the planned start time of the biggest tech event in India's history. Screens around the room glowed with soft blue light. The Prime Minister was already seated in the front row, flanked by senior ministers and advisors. His face was calm, but his fingers tapped the armrest with quiet urgency. It was not just the event at stake. There were other things happening. Darker things. Far away from this bright hall in Delhi, floodwaters had swept through a rural district after a sudden dam burst. Hundreds were missing. Entire villages had lost power. And the news of the disaster had reached the capital only an hour before the opening ceremony. Whispers had begun to spread through the corridors backstage. Some said the Prime Minister was considering canceling the event out of respect. Others said it would be a mistake to cancel, that the world was watching. Still others said the decision no longer mattered. The only person who could turn this moment around was not here yet. Sundar Pichai stood alone in a quiet corner of the backstage area, his hands resting lightly on a folded piece of paper in his pocket. He had written no speech. There had been no time. He had just gotten off a call from one of his childhood friends who still lived in their old neighborhood in Chennai. Her voice had been shaky. She was not worried about the event. She was worried about her nephew who had traveled north for a job interview and was now unreachable. No signal. No news. Sundar had promised her he would try to help. And now, standing in silence with the weight of the world pressing in, he wondered if he had made the right choice coming here at all. He thought of his mother. She had never gone to college. She had never traveled abroad. But she had taught him everything that mattered. She used to tell him, "Words are not always the answer, Sundar. Sometimes silence can carry more truth than 1,000 speeches." He remembered how she would light a single candle during power cuts and sit beside him while he did his schoolwork. She never pushed him to be the best. She pushed him to be kind, to be patient, to listen before speaking. And now, those lessons came back to him like old songs in the middle of noise. A stagehand approached him quietly. "Sir," the man said softly. "They're waiting." Sundar nodded, but he did not move right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the crowd fade behind his thoughts. This was not just another keynote. This was not about product launches or market strategies. This was about something deeper, about what people needed in a moment of uncertainty. And he still did not know exactly what he was going to say. As he stepped out onto the stage, the lights shifted. The chatter in the hall dropped sharply. All eyes turned to him. Cameras blinked red. The room fell still, as if the very air was holding its breath. Sundar walked slowly toward the microphone. He did not hold notes. He carried no device. He simply looked out at the crowd, and then at the Prime Minister, whose expression was unreadable. He stopped. He did not speak. 5 seconds passed, then 10. People began to shift in their seats. Confusion began to flicker in their eyes. Was something wrong? Had he forgotten his speech? But Sundar remained still. He looked not at the cameras but at the faces in the crowd. He searched them, not for applause, not for attention, but for connection. He saw fear. He saw hope. He saw the quiet desperation of a country caught between sorrow and celebration. Then at last he leaned gently into the microphone and spoke 5 soft words. "I stand with you today." There was no cheer, no clapping, just a long, quiet wave of breath passing through the audience. Those 5 words were not loud. They were not clever, but they were real, and they carried a kind of calm that filled the space like warm light after a storm. In the front row, the Prime Minister's hand stopped tapping. He looked at Sundar for a long moment. Then he leaned slightly forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing as if seeing the moment in a new way. A senior advisor whispered something into his ear. The Prime Minister nodded but did not move. He was waiting. And then, suddenly, a sharp sound rang out from the rear of the hall. The screens flickered. The lights dimmed. Somewhere backstage, a power relay had failed. The hall dipped into semi-darkness. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. The live stream, still broadcasting to millions online, went black. Panic stirred behind the curtains. Engineers rushed to their stations. Techs shouted instructions. Someone shouted, "We've lost the feed." Others reached for their phones. Security tightened their grip. But Sundar stayed where he was. Calm. Still. He looked out at the faces, still waiting. Still unsure. He could feel the pressure mounting. This moment could fall apart at any second. He knew that. But instead of panicking, he thought again of his mother, of the candle, of the silence that always held meaning. So he said nothing. He simply looked out, eyes gentle, steady, unafraid. In that moment, even the darkness seemed to soften. But the question remained, heavy and unanswered in every heart in the room. 5 impossible seconds. For a few long moments, the grand hall in Delhi felt like it was floating outside of time. The walls stood tall and silent, dimly lit by emergency lights that glowed red, near the floor. The main screen had gone black. The live stream was down. The backup generators had kicked in, but only partially. Flickers of light moved like restless shadows across the faces of hundreds seated inside. Reporters lowered their cameras. Students glanced nervously at their phones. Ministers shifted in their chairs, whispering softly. Even the Prime Minister, usually calm under pressure, leaned toward his aides and spoke in a low, fast voice. But on the stage, Sundar Pichai stood still. He had not flinched when the screens went dark. He had not stepped back when the whispers began. Instead, he remained at the microphone, his eyes fixed not on the technology, but on the people in front of him. And in that quiet, half-lit moment, he thought not of disaster, not of failure, but of something his father once told him when he was very young. When the lights go out, listen, don't speak yet, because in darkness, the truth of people rises. Those words now rang in his memory, more clearly than the murmurs in the hall. 5 seconds had passed since he last spoke. 5 impossible seconds. Every second felt like its own world, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Sundar could feel the fear in the air, but also the longing, for calm, for clarity, for something human and real. People were not looking at the screens anymore. They were looking at him. In a world so used to movement and noise, this stillness was louder than anything. Sundar stepped slightly closer to the edge of the stage. His voice, when it came again, was steady, low, and warm. "I did not come here today to speak about success," he said. "Not about new apps or smart devices. I came here to speak about something more important." He paused. He let his words settle. "I came to speak about silence." A soft sound rose in the back of the hall. Someone had begun to cry. Not loudly, just a quiet, choked breath that broke into the stillness. Sundar looked in that direction. He didn't try to silence it. He didn't ignore it. Instead, he acknowledged it with a single nod. And then gently, he told a story. He spoke of the first time he had ever stood in front of a crowd, not in America, not at Google, but in Chennai, when he was 12 years old. It had been a small school function and he was supposed to speak about his dreams. He remembered holding the microphone, shaking, barely able to look up from the paper in his hand. The microphone was old and squeaked. The students laughed. He had said only one sentence before his throat closed and he froze. He remembered his mother sitting in the second row. She had not laughed. She had not looked disappointed. She had simply folded her hands and smiled at him, a small calm smile as if to say, "You do not have to be perfect. You only have to be true." He remembered putting down the paper and just saying what was in his heart. Now, so many years later, standing in front of this vast crowd and far, More watching online, if the feed ever returned. He felt that same fear. That same question. Would people listen? Not to his titles, not to his achievements, but to his truth? He breathed. Our country is hurting, he said. Some of you here may have lost someone in the floods. Some of you may be worried about your families, and some of you may be wondering why we are even here, why we gather when so many are suffering. He paused again. I understand that question. He stepped back from the microphone and looked down for a moment, and then he said something that made the room lean in even closer. Earlier today, the Prime Minister was prepared to cancel this event. A ripple of shock passed through the hall. People glanced at each other. Reporters reached for their notepads. The Prime Minister's face remained unreadable, but his fingers stopped moving. He was listening. He was ready to stop everything, Sundar said, his voice low but clear, until I asked him not to. Another silence fell, deeper now, heavier. People were hanging on his every word. I didn't ask him with a speech, he said. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I just said 5 words. Sundar looked out at the crowd. 5 silent words. No one else heard them. He smiled gently. And I won't repeat them here, because those words were not meant for this room. They were meant for one heart in one moment. People leaned back, puzzled. Some looked disappointed, others intrigued. But Sundar's tone didn't change. He didn't explain further. He didn't try to impress. Instead, he began to speak of something deeper. He talked about respect. How respect is not earned only by titles or wealth or fame, but by how we listen when others are in pain. He talked about resilience, not the kind that makes you louder or stronger in argument, but the kind that allows you to sit with silence, to hold your breath in fear and still move forward with kindness. He talked about kindness itself, how it had shaped every step of his life, how the people who helped him most were not always the most successful or the most brilliant, but the ones who were patient, who saw him, who made him feel that he mattered. And as he spoke, the screens at the back of the hall flickered once. Then again, a technician backstage held his breath. Fingers raced over a control panel. An engineer whispered, "We might be coming back." And then, slowly, like a dawn rising over distant hills, the live stream returned. The room glowed once again with soft blue light, and just as it did, the Prime Minister rose to his feet. His expression was no longer stern. It was full of thought. He looked directly at Sundar. Then he looked at the crowd, and in a moment that would be replayed 1,000 times across every screen in the nation, he stepped forward and reached for the microphone. What would he say? Was the event saved, or was something far more important just beginning? Echoes of humility. The room stood still. The Prime Minister's fingers touched the edge of the microphone. For a brief moment, he didn't speak. His eyes moved slowly across the hall from the crowd to the cameras and finally back to Sundar Pichai, who remained beside him on the stage, standing quietly, his hands folded in front of him. The silence between them was not heavy. It was not tense. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something important is said. When the Prime Minister finally spoke, his voice was soft, not weak, but full of something unexpected. Weight, yes, but also warmth. His tone was lower than usual, less formal, as though he was speaking not just to a crowd, but to someone he knew well. Sometimes, he said, a leader must listen before he acts. There was a murmur in the crowd. Many had never heard him speak like this before. When I entered this hall, he continued, my heart was divided. I had just received reports from across the country. I had seen the images. Flooded, streets, families waiting on rooftops, children carried through waist-deep water. I thought to myself, how can we speak of innovation today when others are crying out for help? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He did not pause. He let it break. And because he did not hide it, the truth in it landed deeper. I was ready to cancel this gathering, he said, to walk away from these cameras, from these lights, and return to the people who are hurting. Then he turned toward Sundar. And then, this man, he said, walked into my office. He did not sit down. He did not bring a folder. He did not ask for my time. He only stood there. The crowd leaned in, still eager to know what was said. And after a long silence, the Prime Minister said, he looked at me, and he gave me 5 words, not loud, not clever, just simple words. And they changed my mind. He looked back at the audience. I will not tell you what those words were. They were not for cameras. They were for my conscience. The room was quiet. Even the press stopped typing. For once, no one interrupted. But I will tell you this, the Prime Minister continued. Those 5 words reminded me of something I had forgotten. That progress is not the opposite of compassion, and leadership is not the absence of doubt. It is the presence of humility. He paused. So we will not cancel this event. A wave of relief swept through the room. Someone clapped, then another, and suddenly the hall erupted in a slow, respectful applause. Not loud or wild, but steady, like the sound of rain tapping gently on windows. A kind of applause that meant more than approval. It meant understanding. But not everyone in the room clapped. In a darkened corner near the back row, a group of corporate delegates remained seated. One of them, a well-known figure from the international tech community, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "What's the point of all this? Sentiment? We came for deals, not drama." His words weren't loud, but they reached a woman nearby, a young developer who had traveled 2 days by train just to be here. She looked over at him, her eyes tired but firm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence carried its own quiet resistance. Backstage, a junior technician wiped sweat from his forehead. The power surge had been stabilized, but the system was still fragile. He was only 24. This was his first major assignment. And he had been moments away from a full breakdown when Sundar had walked past him earlier and placed a hand on his shoulder. He hadn't said anything, just that single gesture, and somehow it had helped. Later, he would say it was the first time someone of Sundar's status had ever touched his shoulder without asking for anything in return. The technician turned back to his station, breathing steadily now. On stage, Sundar stepped forward again. "I don't think today is about me," he said, "or even about technology. It's about remembering why we build what we build." He looked out at the crowd. We build so others can rise. His voice was not emotional, but it carried weight, like an anchor finding the ocean floor. We code not just for users, but for people. We design not just for profit, but for purpose. And when a storm comes, like the one our country faces today, we are reminded that the tools we make are only as strong as the people we make them for. A student in the second row who had been live streaming with her phone before the outage now sat with tears in her eyes. Her father was in one of the flood-affected districts. She hadn't been able to reach him all morning. But now, hearing these words, she felt something shift. She didn't feel powerless. She felt seen, and that feeling began to ripple through the room. Something rare was happening. This was no longer just an event. It was a kind of gathering of breath, a remembering of values that were often lost behind brand names and billion-dollar valuations. It was no longer about who would get funding or who would speak last. It was about connection, truth, dignity. And yet deep inside the crowd, something else was stirring. A different kind of voice. A man in a charcoal suit reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small device. He turned to his assistant, whispering urgently, "We need to make sure the media doesn't spin this into a sob story," he said. "This needs to be refocused. Hard numbers, product launches, none of this emotional nonsense." The assistant nodded, but something in her eyes said she had already stopped believing in that version of the story, because no matter how hard they tried to reframe it, the truth had already been spoken aloud. The Prime Minister stepped back from the microphone. Sundar remained still, and in that stillness, the entire room seemed to settle, as if something sacred had just passed through. And then, from the back of the room, a hand went up, shaky, young. A woman, barely more than a girl, stood slowly. She wore a simple scarf and carried a folded notebook. She looked nervous, but she began to walk forward. No one stopped her. Not yet. And in that moment, it became clear. This story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Resilience under pressure. For a few seconds, the entire room turned to look at the girl, standing near the back. She held her notebook tightly, both hands gripping it as if it might float away if she let go. She wore no badge, no corporate lanyard, no press pass. Her scarf was slightly askew, and her sandals looked worn from travel. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Her eyes flicked between Sundar and the Prime Minister, then to the crowd, and then back to the notebook. Sundar saw the hesitation. He took a single step forward, then stopped. He didn't need to go further. The gesture was enough. It told her, "You're safe here." She drew in a shaky breath, then said something so soft. Many in the room barely heard it. "I didn't think I would ever get this far." The voice was small, but the truth behind it was not. Her name was Amrita. She was 19. She had come from a small town in Bihar where her family owned a small roadside shop. When she was 13, she found a broken phone behind the shop. It didn't work, but she took it apart and tried to understand how it was built. Years later, using borrowed books and late-night internet at a friend's house, she taught herself how to code. No one in her village knew what she was doing. They only saw her sit for hours, her eyes fixed to a glowing screen. Her uncle told her to stop. Her cousins laughed. Even her teacher said she should focus on marriage, not machines. But she kept going now. Standing here, she looked impossibly out of place in a room of billionaires and diplomats. Yet, something about her presence was undeniable. "I didn't come here to speak," she said. "I came to listen. But when I saw you on stage, sir," she looked at Sundar, "I felt something move inside me." The room was still. Sundar nodded quietly, encouraging her to continue. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Not just for your success, but for how you carry it." The Prime Minister turned slightly toward Sundar, his expression soft again, and then, without warning, the lights above flickered violently. A few sparks popped from a panel near the back wall. A technician shouted something backstage. The screens flashed white, then black, then nothing. Again. The live stream dropped for the second time in an hour. Only this time, something was different. The backup systems didn't respond. The failsafe server, tucked deep inside the broadcast center, had overheated. Cooling fans had failed. And now data was freezing. Audio was skipping. The feed that was supposed to reach millions across the globe had vanished once more, leaving behind only static. A surge of panic swept through the crew. Engineers scrambled to their consoles. Technicians whispered into headsets. The junior technician from earlier, Aaron, was now kneeling beside the backup relay, sweat dripping down his forehead. He felt his stomach drop. "Sir," he whispered into his mic, "the livestream core is failing. We're not going to recover with the current load. Too many input channels. We need to dump the side feeds." His supervisor snapped back. "No. Protocol says we keep the full stream. Don't cut." Aaron hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. If he followed protocol, the entire system might crash for good. If he broke it, he might lose his job. But in his chest, something stirred. He remembered Sundar's quiet hand on his shoulder just hours earlier. No orders, no threats, just trust. He typed fast. "I'm rerouting the side feeds, compressing output, switching to local mirror stream." His hands moved quickly, the lines of code blinking across the screen. The monitor flickered. Processors slowed. The room temperature dropped by a single degree. And then, the screen came back. Only a single camera feed. Low quality, but it was live. And it showed one thing. Amrita, still standing, her hands now trembling slightly, but her voice growing stronger. "I want to build things that help people," she said. "Even if no one knows my name." Even if I never get to speak on a stage, I want to make something that reaches someone. Her words were not perfect. They didn't need to be. Sundar turned toward the control room where a small green light now glowed, indicating the feed was live again. He smiled. Then he turned back to the hall. "We have a saying in my mother's language," he said softly. "Roughly, it means, the tree does not boast about its shadow, but it gives shade anyway." People in the front row nodded slowly. "Resilience," he said, "is not just surviving, it's serving. Without praise, without promise, just the quiet belief that what you do matters." Someone in the media section wiped tears from her cheek. A young man beside her, once skeptical, now sat with his hand over his mouth, stunned. In the far corner, the executive who had earlier called this a sob story looked uneasy, because he could feel the room slipping away from the old narrative. No longer power, no longer control, but something deeper, something they couldn't package or monetize. And suddenly, Sundar turned to the screen, now showing only the single camera shot. He looked directly into it. Millions were watching again, perhaps not in perfect quality, but with perfect attention, and he said something that no one expected. He spoke not to investors, not to politicians, not even to the people in the room, but to everyone outside the walls. "If you are watching this," he said, "and you've ever felt like you don't belong in the room, this is your invitation." His voice trembled slightly. "We are building a world where you do belong." Then he paused. "But we can't build it without you." The screen flickered once more, and then something strange happened. Not a failure, not a glitch, but a shape. Someone had stepped into frame, behind Sundar. A tall shadow, a figure, unexpected. Someone no one had seen on the guest list. The crowd gasped, security turned, Sundar turned, and the room froze again. Who was this person? What were they doing here? And why were they walking toward the microphone? Kindness wins respect. The first thing people noticed was not his face. It was his walk. Slow, unsure, not the stride of someone used to stages, or spotlights, or being seen. More like someone stepping forward because something inside him would not let him stay seated. He wore no formal clothes. Just a faded shirt tucked into dark trousers, both slightly too big for him. His shoes were scuffed. His shoulders leaned forward as if expecting to be stopped at any moment, but no one stopped him. Sundar turned when he heard the steps. He didn't flinch. He didn't wave security forward. He simply waited. And when the boy came closer, yes, a boy, barely 18, it became clear to everyone watching that this was not a planned moment, not a press stunt, not a speaker on the list, just a boy, nervous, shaking, but determined. He looked at Sundar, not with fear, but with a question in his eyes. "Will you allow this?" Sundar stepped aside just slightly, the way someone does when they're making room for a guest in a house that isn't theirs but still feels like home. The boy's throat worked to find a voice. He stood at the microphone. The crowd waited, and then in a voice raw from emotion, he began. "I'm sorry," he said, "I wasn't supposed to be here." He paused, his breath caught. His hands gripped the edge of the podium. "I'm just a boy who came here by mistake." A ripple of confusion spread. "I didn't have a badge," he said. "I just walked in when the crowd moved. No one noticed." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I came because I saw Sundar Sir would be here. I've watched all his talks. I know his story. I know he was like me once." A few people in the audience leaned forward. "I wanted to see him once, not to shake hands, just to know that people like him are real." His voice cracked. "And now I'm here, standing. Somehow." He looked at Sundar again, a soft, unbelieving smile on his lips. "You don't know me. No one here does. But I've been trying to learn, to build, to study. I work all night at a small phone repair shop. During the day I go to the library, when I can. I sleep little. I eat less. The crowd was silent. But I'm still here. Because I believe in something. He looked into the crowd now, not just at Sundar. I believe that people like me are not wasted. We are not invisible. His chest rose with every word. We just need one person to believe back. Sundar's face didn't move much, but his eyes were glassy. He remembered himself. Young, uncertain, walking the streets of Chennai, carrying a small backpack and a big dream. He remembered standing outside internet cafes, wondering if the world behind those screens would ever let someone like him in. And now this boy, this stranger, had just stepped onto a stage he had never been invited to, and somehow made it his own. Then something remarkable happened. Amrita, the young woman from Bihar, stood again. This time she didn't speak. She just walked up the aisle. Her steps were sure, calm. She joined the boy on stage. She took one hand off her notebook and gently placed it on his shoulder. He almost broke into tears. And the crowd, tight with tension moments before, began to shift. The applause didn't start with the front rows. It began in the middle. A young coder clapped once, then again. Then someone next to her joined. Then more. It grew slowly. Not wild. Not forced. But real. It sounded like the walls themselves were clapping. And in that noise, in that warmth, something that had been wound tight inside the boy began to loosen. His shoulders relaxed. His voice steadied. I'm sorry, he said again. But now it was soft and shy. Don't be, Sundar replied gently. The boy blinked. Sundar stepped up beside him. You are the reason we are here, Sundar said. This stage is yours, it always was. The Prime Minister, watching from his seat, did not speak, but he did something else. He stood. No one had asked him to. There was no protocol for it. But he stood quietly, respectfully, and when he did, the entire hall rose with him. Not because he was the Prime Minister, but because the moment deserved. Its respect had been earned, not through force, not through fame, but through kindness. Raw, trembling, brave, Sundar turned to the boy again. What's your name? He asked. The boy hesitated, as if afraid to say it out loud. Then quietly, Dhruv. Sundar nodded. Dhruv, would you be willing to speak again tomorrow? The boy blinked in disbelief. Not here, Sundar added, but at a school nearby, with kids who've never seen someone stand up like you just did. Dhruv nodded slowly. I can try, he whispered. That's all any of us ever do, Sundar said. We try. The hall began to settle. A calm filled the air, a sense that something had just shifted, not in policy, not in agenda, but in atmosphere. Kindness had done something none of the speeches could. It had reminded everyone what leadership looks like when it has nothing to prove. And then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, a child's voice. Young, innocent. What were the 5 words? The crowd turned. A little girl was standing beside her mother, clutching a notebook like Amrita's. What did Sundar Sir say to Modi ji? She asked again. Sundar looked at her, then at the Prime Minister, then back at the camera. He smiled, but said nothing, because the story wasn't finished yet, and some truths live best in silence. Legacy in silence, the question lingered in the air long after the little girl had asked it. 5 simple words. What did Sundar Pichai say to the Prime Minister? That made him stay? What 5 words had shifted the course of an entire national event, calmed a hall full of unrest, softened one of the most powerful leaders in the world, and opened a stage to 2 young strangers who weren't even on the guest list? But Sundar did not answer. He looked at the girl with warmth in his eyes. Not with amusement, not with dismissal, but with deep care. And then, quietly, he smiled. The silence said enough. And somehow no one pressed him again, because by now they understood. Some things are not hidden because they are secrets. Some things are kept quiet because they are sacred. The Prime Minister placed his hands behind his back and slowly walked off the stage, nodding once at Sundar, once at Dhruv, and once, most gently, at Amrita. There was a softness in his step that had not been there when he arrived. Something had shifted, not just in policy, but in presence. Outside the hall, the city moved slowly. Traffic hummed. Birds crossed the sky unnoticed. People passed each other in busy lanes without knowing that inside that building, something rare had happened. Not a headline, not a scandal, not a deal, but a moment of human truth. The live stream came to a close. Millions had watched. Millions more would hear about it later. But the heart of it, the reason it would be remembered, was not the names involved, not the position of the Prime Minister or the fame of Sundar Pichai. It was the feeling. The breathless stillness when Dhruv had spoken. The quiet tears in Amrita's eyes. The warm weight in the room when Sundar said, "We build so others can rise." Backstage, Sundar sat on a wooden bench, sipping a glass of water. The noise had faded. The cameras were gone. He was alone now, or almost. Only Aaron, the young technician, was nearby, still checking wires, pretending not to watch him. Sundar looked up. "You did good work today," he said softly. Aaron paused, shocked that Sundar even remembered him. "I thought the whole thing was going to fall apart," Aaron admitted. "Sometimes it needs to," Sundar replied. "So we can see what was holding it together." Aaron smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir," he said. Sundar nodded and stood, stretching slightly. The sky outside was turning orange with evening. He thought back to the beginning of the day. The message from his old friend in Chennai, the crisis in the north, the heaviness in his chest when he arrived, the weight of saying the right thing, or saying nothing at all. He walked slowly toward the exit, and as he reached the door, someone called his name. It was Dhruv, still holding his worn bag, his eyes tired now. "Sir," he said, "I didn't get to say thank you." Sundar looked at him gently. "You don't need to," he said. "You already said something more important." Dhruv hesitated, then stepped closer. "Can I ask one thing?" he said. "If it's not too much." Sundar waited. "Those 5 words," Dhruv said. "Not what they were. But were they hard to say?" Sundar looked away for a moment. "Very," he replied. And then very softly he said, "They were not for him." "Not really." Dhruv tilted his head. "They were for me," Sundar added. "I said them so I wouldn't forget." A quiet beat passed between them, and Dhruv understood. Because sometimes we say things out loud not to convince others, but to remind ourselves of who we still hope to be. A few days later, in a village school surrounded by fields and dust, Dhruv stood before a class of 10-year-olds. He held nothing in his hands. He had no projector, no screen, just a voice that trembled at first, then grew steadier with every sentence. He told them that being invisible did not mean being unworthy. He told them that failure was not the end. He told them that the world doesn't always open doors for you. But sometimes, if you walk toward one quietly enough, someone on the other side opens it anyway. In another town, Amrita sat under a tree with a group of girls, teaching them how to write basic code using sticks in the dirt. When asked why she was doing it, she simply said, "Because someone made room for me." Back in Delhi, a news anchor closed a segment with these words, "Today's story wasn't about power. It was about pause. And in that pause, something honest was born." And Sundar? He returned to his hotel that night, tired but calm. Before turning off the light, he took out a small notebook from his bag, the same one he used on every trip. He opened to the back page. 5 words were written there, not in bold ink, not underlined, just quietly placed. They were not shared, not spoken again, but they were enough. He whispered them once to himself, then closed the notebook and placed it beside his bed. Outside the window, the city breathed. Somewhere, a boy opened his first browser tab. A girl turned the page of a borrowed textbook. A mother told her child, "You can." And across a million homes, something quiet and steady began to grow. Not noise, not applause, but legacy. Born not from fame or speeches, but from 5 silent words.